Hello there. I just wanted to make a quick video to draw everyone's attention to a crime that seems to be invading everybody's lives at the moment, a growing crime, and this is the act of exploiting or using terminal illnesses to profit from patients. And this of course involves hiding cures to terminal illnesses, terminal chronic illnesses, with a view to financially exploiting patients, as many as possible, until the day they die. And this came to my attention. This is from a personal point of view in about 2012 when I drew this picture here for my local MP as part of a presentation to raise his awareness to what I could see was a shocking exploitation of cancer patients after suffering over 17 years of abuse. That was by the time I drew this in 2012. And this is me sitting in the middle here, getting it from every angle, from my doctor who was telling me that severe cancer symptoms were normal, from my friends and family who were fully supporting my doctor and wading in with abuse of their own, and the police who were very heavy-handed with me whenever I came into contact with them, and cancer charities who offered virtually no help whatsoever to all my requests and phone calls, etc., explaining the difficulties that I was encountering. Now, this problem initially came to my attention when I noticed an overlap between the problems sinus cancer patients like myself have suffered and what those of COVID-19 patients are suffering. Now, it's quite surprising to find so many attributes that are shared by both illnesses, and this starts of course with a rather unusual one. This is that sinus cancer patients suffer from right at the start. Patients lose taste and smell. This is suffering I suffered from quite severely, and COVID-19 patients have recently complained of the same problem. And patients forced into isolation. It's very common not just for sinus cancer patients, but all cancer patients of course fall into that category, as do COVID-19 patients, and both fall victim to external abuse, including domestic abuse, and of course that's fairly inevitable sadly when you're locked up for long periods. Both diseases can be terminal, and there's a suggestion here in the word can that they don't have to be terminal, but if you hide or spend enough effort hiding the cures or suppressing effective treatments that can terminate the disease, then obviously there's a huge amount of money that can be made by convincing the patient that indeed the disease just happens to be terminal. And so both diseases can be used to make billions from simply by hiding cures, suggesting that yes, financial opportunists queue up to exploit, manipulate patients on as big a scale as possible. Now, both have fallen victim to scams, lies and con artists, perhaps on a scale that we're not able to even imagine at the moment or fully appreciate. And of course there's a whole load of other illnesses that fall into this category, that all should be included as part and parcel of this web of exploitation, medical exploitation, that starts with a short list of terminal illnesses that fall prey to ruthless financial exploitation: cancer in general, leukemia, AIDS. This is the HIV, human immunodeficiency syndrome, or virus, sorry. This disease I can't pronounce, Leishman syndrome, heart disease, Ebola, hemorrhagic fever, thank you, and COVID-19 has been latched onto the bottom of this recently. And we can already see how this list is growing, which is very surprising, really, considering that these illnesses are not just thousands of years old; they're millions of years old. And by this time, in this modern, so-called civilized era that we're living in, we should have at least found permanent solutions to many of these illnesses by now. But of course, there's too much money in that, as we shall see in a moment. Well, perhaps you can appreciate already. And of course, you can add to this list, this is the chronic conditions, ones that are not quite so serious and will not necessarily end a patient's life as abruptly as terminal illnesses do, but still will be with a patient for the rest of their life in the majority of cases, and therefore fall into the category of possible diseases that can be exploited by financial third parties and opportunists. And of course, this is again a very long list of illnesses that have been capitalized on by drug companies now for at least 100 years, and for that reason have not therefore been the victim of or the subject of any research that has been able to find a permanent cure to any of these conditions, quite simply again because there's too much money to be made out of it. Now, in my particular case, I came down with sinus cancer, and the reason for that I will touch upon in a moment. But just briefly, this tumour started growing in my left sinus cavity here, exacting pressure on my head like a vice slowly exerts pressure on the head, and understandably in time you end up with a mild facial distortion, which I was very lucky was not any more serious than it is, but still unfortunate that it has warped my face slightly. And this came also with severe dental corrosion, which is exacerbated by sinus cancer. For some reason, it's another symptom of sinus cancer that tooth decay is accelerated, and unfortunately results in my case, with over the loss of half my teeth. Now, this, as I say, came about, as I've tried to explain here in this timeline, due to accidents I had in the early part of my life. This is in 1981. I was hit by a car head on. My head went straight through the windscreen. I wrote the car off. Extremely lucky to survive. A few years later, when I was 17 years old, I had an accident while briefly experimenting with drugs. When somebody swapped a wrap of amphetamine for some washing powder, which I then realised, or some years later, was 90% bleach, as is all washing powder, which inevitably, very sadly, ended up in the manifestation of a tumour in my sinus cavity. This is 11 years later, in 1995. And this then marked the start of a whole ream of abuses, isolation, lockdown, and exploitation that I suffered for about the next 25 years. So this red line here is how long I've battled cancer for. The green line marks the beginning of physical assaults that I was subjected to, and the yellow line marks an intensification of the isolation and threats and terrorism that I've been subjected to. And since the cancer first started in 1995, and the physical, like I said, the isolation was virtually forced on me from day one, simply because my symptoms were so severe that I was not deemed trustworthy, I suppose, to be released into the community in such a sick state. So it was self-imposed also to a large degree. But then came all of a sudden these physical assaults that were aimed at me, which I didn't expect. This is from a new partner of an ex-girlfriend. Suddenly came at me with a brick one day because he decided he didn't want me visiting my son anymore. And this marked the beginning of a whole string of Hello there. Yeah, I was just trying to explain the isolation, lockdown, and abuses I'd suffered during my ordeal with sinus cancer. And this started, of course, with the isolation, self-imposed isolation in 1995. I wasn't completely isolated, I hasten to add. I was just more isolated than your average person, that's all. And in 2003, 8 years later, I suddenly became the victim of these a whole string of physical assaults that started with this chap here, Dan Marshall, who decided to come at me with a brick. Took a disliking to me, probably saw I looked quite unwell, didn't look like a normal person, was in a vulnerable disposition, and he wasted no time taking advantage of that. And being the new boyfriend of my ex-girlfriend, he decided to come at me with a brick. And lo and behold, actually went running down to the police station to try and stitch me up with his own offences, with his own crimes, and he had a surprising amount of luck in even him and his then girlfriend Anita Fairbank were taking me to the Crown Court and literally trying to frame me for their own offences and make me look like the offender, stitch up this sick cancer patient and pop him in jail for offences that were committed against me, which almost came to pass, but the judge, I think, just saw that there was there's something not quite right about all these lies and perjury and falsified statements, and just let me go at the end. But nevertheless, I mean, it's a very clear indication there that these offenders do tend to run down to the police station and try and stitch up, their victim whenever they have unleashed one of their horrible assaults upon them. So look out for that one. And as I say, this went on and on. I think rumours, as they do spread through the local community, did seem to encourage other people to jump on this bandwagon. I had other people launching assaults at me. This is friends of ex-girlfriends and relatives, etc. That all culminated in a brutal murder attempt. This is in 2012 by a chap called Asher Osmondson. And the timing of this brutal murder attempt was quite extraordinary in that it chimed exactly in with my discovery of some very effective treatments and ways to reverse the symptoms of sinus cancer, which I believe therefore is not a coincidence at all, and quite clearly could have been a motive for this chap Asher Osmondson to end my life. Now, the reasons for that can be more clearly seen in this little picture I've drawn here, which asks the question, who benefits from suppressing cures? Pharmaceutical companies seeking to peddle partially effective treatments, I think, should be top of the list, because very clearly the art of making a treatment, and they very clearly seem to have thousands of scientists out there given the task of finding treatments that are not 100% effective, only 50%, only 60% effective, which is extremely important, of course, because that keeps the customer coming back for more, and hopefully coming back for more until the day they die. Which is the most lucrative way to manage an illness, and of course they're only too aware of this. Now, jumping on the back of this bandwagon, you have charities, of course, who rush out claiming and pretending to look for cures, who in reality only spend their money on suppressing them. And this is a very common illusion that they erect for the public, that of being on an urgent quest to find a cure, when in reality they have been actively suppressing them as much and as violently as possible since you can remember. And of course their livelihoods depend on it. Their livelihoods depend on you not finding out, on the public not seeing through the illusion, in the knowledge that, of course, if they ever did, their salaries would end the same day. And their ill-gotten income would finish that same moment. So you can now begin to maybe appreciate, that these are two very large conglomerates who are extremely powerful. Pharmaceutical companies, some of the most powerful businesses on earth. Charities not far behind. They're these cancer charities and health charities, and combined, I mean, make an alarming force, that no one can reckon with, really. I mean, they can outnumber and outgun pretty much any opponent. And here comes the problem when, or the active employment of violent murdering bullies and psychopaths who are quietly cajoled, encouraged and excused while they routinely beat patients who discover effective cures to death. To suggest to you that basically these powerful businesses do pass money under the table and actively encourage violent murdering bullies and psychopaths to beat patients to death, and this includes even doctors and anybody else for that matter who runs about sharing information about effective natural treatments. They don't necessarily have to be natural. I mean, if they have any method that can permanently stop a terminal disease in its tracks and cure a patient, then they are in the firing line. And of course, the more effective the cure, the more violence they can expect. And the more they are threatening the salaries of these charities and pharmaceutical companies, with a potential cure, the more violence they can expect. To suggest to you that if you find a very effective cure, like for example for sinus cancer, that could stop quite possibly thousands of years of profiteering and manipulation, then you can almost 100% expect to be brutally murdered. And this, of course, it also suggests that these people are so rich they're able to pay off the police as well, in order just to keep the money flowing and make sure that there are no obstacles to their income in the future. Now, this then maybe gives a slightly clearer insight into what happened to me in 2012 and why I was the subject of such a brutal battering after struggling with sinus cancer for 17 years. I mean, why anyone should deserve that kind of treatment after struggling with sinus cancer for 17 years, I'm not sure. And also add to that the fact that I was hit by a car that left me with quite a serious head injury when I was 14 years old. And you can see how desperate these people are to beat innocent patients to death. I mean, they are literally, not just keen, they are absolutely desperate. And I cannot underestimate or cannot suggest to you, how widespread this problem is, how much it's growing and evolving, and how many efforts are made just to cover up the truth. Whether this involves bribery, blackmail, bribing the police to shut up about it, sweep murders under the carpet, you name it, it's escalating daily. And it's therefore no surprise maybe to find that once I had managed, this is by about 2018, I'd managed to literally find a huge or collect a long list of very effective treatments to reverse my personal symptoms of sinus cancer, which then enabled me to round up my abusers, collect a lot of the evidence that I had lying about, pop them all in a net. This is all my abusers here that would have been frantically beating me since 2003. Collected all the evidence, popped it into YouTube videos, funnily enough, which you can find on my channel. There's dozens of them, and handed them all into the police, who certainly raised an eyebrow, but said that because a lot of the crimes have been reported late, then they were not able to do something about it. And certainly this was true in some of the cases, and I must admit in this particular case I should have gone to the police after this, but I had one cannabis plant growing, which at the time I believe was more valuable to me than reporting this chap to the police, quite simply because the story had broken on the internet just around 2012 that cannabis oil cures cancer. So I decided that the plant was more valuable to me than reporting this chap, and by the time I got rid of the plant, Of course, the police weren't interested anymore. So there. Hi there. I was just trying to explain how the culmination of 25 years of struggling with sinus cancer and the collection of some very powerful, effective treatments to the illness that can effectively reverse the symptoms and the suffering that sinus cancer patients endure, which cannot be underestimated, also resulted in my being able to round up all my abusers, which perhaps is no coincidence when we just go back to this brief list here. So, I mean, basically, when I rounded up the cures, when I found out that there were cures, that these charities were playing games and the pharmaceuticals companies were all just sort of in the mix to make money. So once I rumbled these two, I was able to gather up all these guys, pop them all in one net, and hand them into the police, which is what this net is here. It's basically the charities, the pharmaceutical companies, and my abusers all in one big bag. And you can imagine what a challenge or what a struggle that is. I mean, not just for myself, but any patient who's struggling with a terminal illness, who maybe doesn't quite appreciate what they're up against. And the roots of this go back a very long way, and I'd like to just look into a little bit more deeply what's going on here with this subject of hiding cures, because this also now affects all COVID patients and the coronavirus outbreak pandemic that's happening at the moment, which I believe, as like all things, has roots that go back many thousands of years. And as cures for sinus cancer kept arriving and a wealth of ingenious tricks continued to reveal themselves, it quickly became clear all these solutions were ancient. Now, I could see this, of course, from the very nature of the solutions that I'd found. Things like the alkaline diet, which I'll show you in a moment, and oil pulling, were very clearly very ancient. This is just at first sight, just from using just common sense and intuition, and the research charities, of course, had destroyed them to collect vast sums of money on totally fraudulent and false pretenses. Now, I'll just very briefly go into what these cures were, just to show you how ancient they are and how I came to the conclusion that they were very ancient. Though my sinus cancer problem began in 1995, it was not until 17 years later that I finally found ways to reverse my hellish symptoms. The alkaline diet was one of my first discoveries, paving the way for more revelations over the next 8 years. And this was part of the realization that cancer grows in an acidic environment and can therefore be reversed by alkalizing our body and our body cells, to make it more of an inhospitable environment for cancer, and therefore permanently remove the illness. And it's in the permanent removal of the illness, of course, that that incites so much ferocious response. Now, these solutions included also things like oil pulling, which I realised could very easily have saved all my teeth if only I had known about it right at the beginning in 1995. And I waited the best part of 22 years just to discover that in 2018 I was astonished to discover that oil pulling reversed my desperate dental issues. And you cannot describe my disappointment to find out that, holy crap, I lost over half of my teeth just to a simple little trick, an ingenious trick that's very clearly many thousands of years old. Because let's face it, ancient people, I'm sure 5,000, 10,000 years ago, knew how to extract oil from plants and were using it to keep their teeth clean. You can trust me. And of course, the gain this is easily going to become the target for violent oppression from people like the Dental Society, who can see a huge problem here as far as an obstacle to their income if they let this knowledge proliferate and be shared in the community. So they are frantically, obviously, in the business to lie as much as they can about this and tell everybody it doesn't work and fluoride is the answer, etc., etc. Now, as I tried to suggest a moment ago, this also extends to things like COVID-19, which I also discovered possible solutions to the coronavirus, again the subject of a great deal of suppression and controversy, but this could this be another example of ancient cures that were destroyed to make way for big profits? And this is suggested by this originally in a document published by this chap, Steve Barwick, who noted that colloidal silver beats, this is the old family of coronaviruses, and compiled a lot of clinical documentation to demonstrate his findings. Now, this very clearly again suggests that there were plagues happening many thousands of years ago, and there were solutions to it. There were doctors around many thousands of years ago who may well have found ways to combat these plagues. Plagues are not a new thing, and this is something that we tend to forget. You know, that illness and health and financial exploitation of patients is by no means a new thing. It's as old as the sun. You know, it goes back highly likely millions of years, not just thousands of years, right to the roots of, you know, when we were running around in caves or, you know, up in trees. Now, very briefly, how does this work? I mean, from a sinus cancer point of view, it is a ruthless business. And as I say, this is thousands of years old, this business, and a very dirty business. And it's quite alarming, quite disturbing to realise that, this is when I realised that countless others have suffered similar abuses for thousands of years simply to mutilate people for profit. I was angry and disgusted, suggesting very clearly that yes, you know, when you do hide cures, effective treatments for sinus cancer, this then gives you the opportunity to distort and push people's faces into these awful shapes, you know, which is a permanent problem. And of course, this is perfect picture candy for charities that want to rake in money. In other words, the more mutilated they can leave your face, and the more mutilated faces that they can create, the more money that, you know, potentially they can rake in. And of course, you know, that's the dirtiest business on the planet, to be beating people to death like myself. I mean, quite literally, you know, organising and encouraging these kinds of brutal attacks that happened to me in 2012, you know, was only necessary for one reason and one reason only, you know, to suppress the cures, get rid of all these cures that I was trying to expose and collect, stop me from handing out all these abusers, you know, pharmaceutical companies and charities into the police, with a view to very clearly giving them a free rein to just push people's faces into all these awful shapes, and use those faces then to just collect ever increasing amounts of money for themselves. Now, this again applies very clearly, unfortunately, to COVID-19, which, when we have a look back here, you know, there's similarities with sinus cancer and COVID-19. Again, we find that, you know, these diseases fall into much the same categories, and rather noticeably and rather worryingly, AIDS and COVID-19, you know, the COVID-19 latched onto the bottom of this list here, shows that again we're losing control of this list. It's growing, it's not shrinking. And it also suggests to you that AIDS is not a naturally occurring illness. Again, when we look into the subject of health challenges, health conditions, we'll find that animals, monkeys, chimpanzees, bats never suffered from any terminal deadly illness for millions of years until humans came along and built laboratories and started manufacturing viruses with the specific intention to make money out of them and keep us patients sick for the rest of their life. And that was the motive behind making AIDS. And it's no coincidence that the suspicious narrative that we heard around the time that AIDS suddenly materialized is very similar to COVID-19. And we heard, oh yes, it suddenly started in a chimpanzee. A chimpanzee woke up one day with AIDS and then decided to give it to his wife, you know, or something. It was just the most ridiculous story you've ever heard, you know, and this illness suddenly just killing people, you know, killing animals and people just out of nowhere. And of course a very similar narrative to what we've heard with COVID-19. Oh, it started in a bat, jumped to a human, and we're off again. But of course, if you look into my other videos,